during the entire campaign. We scored the candidates' proposals. We fact-check all sorts of things. We work with the media. We work with our coalition around the country to try to focus on fiscal policy. And I think it's an incredibly important moment for the country because as we now are moving from campaigning to governing, there's a huge question that's still out there, whether, I think there were a lot of very important issues that have to do with the economy that were raised during the campaign, but fiscal policy certainly wasn't the center of the discussion. And if we're going to deal with the fact that the country is facing near record levels of debt and that the debt is on an unsustainable path, we are going to have to, as we transition towards governing, think about hard choices, budgetary trade-offs. All is part of a comprehensive plan to grow the economy, of which fiscal responsibility is one of the biggest underpinnings of a comprehensive economic growth plan. So I'm going to turn it over to our co-chairs today. I am really delighted to have, gosh, there's so many things that go on explaining everything they've done. So Governor/President Daniels, who was an OMB director, governor, and now president of Purdue. Former Congressman Tim Penny, who has been a co-chair of our committee not once but twice. A member of Congress for many years, worked on a lot of different issues, had his own budget plan, was on the Social Security Commission, has worked on these issues for quite some time. And Leon Panetta, who, let's hope I get every one of these things right, has been the chairman of the Budget Committee, the chief of staff, the director of OB, these aren't in order, the secretary of defense, the head of the CIA, lots of other things too. So we really have an incredible group, and then many of our board meeting members who are here as well. So please join me in thanking them. Wait one second before we thank them. And as soon as they're done, we're talking a little bit about this remark. We're going to be joined by Greg Ick, who is one of the great thinkers and writers at the Wall Street Journal, who will lead us in a moderated discussion. So thanks for joining us, and thank you to our panel.
Thank you very much, Maya, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to this session. I want to, first of all, thank Maya for her leadership on the committee and for the great work by the staff on the report that we are presenting to the President-elect. The reason we're here is because, unfortunately, we never seem to learn the lessons of history. I think it was 28 years ago when I was chair of the Budget Committee. And at that time, President-elect Bush was elected and asked that I come to the Vice President's house to brief him on issues involving the budget. And as you'll recall, he ran on the promise of read my lips when your taxes. So at the time, I presented to him the concerns about the need to focus on what was a growing deficit at that time and a growing debt. And I said to him, Mr. President, whatever your priorities are, whatever you want to do as president, you will not have the resources to be able to commit to those priorities unless you deal with this issue. And unless you're willing to make the tough choices that have to do with fiscal responsibility. And the President, to his credit, said, recognizing politics of what he'd just been through, nevertheless said at the time that he realized the importance of dealing with the deficit, and that at some point he hoped in the course of the administration that he would have the opportunity to be able to come to some kind of budget agreement that would deal with that. And to his credit, we did that. As some of you may recall, and there's some familiar faces in this audience, we went out to Andrews Air Force Base and spent a few weeks out at Andrews Air Force Base with the key members of Congress and with everything on the table. Everything on the table. Discretionary spending, defense spending, entitlement spending, and taxes. And it was not easy. It never is. But we went through a difficult negotiation the Democrats came forward and presented spending savings, largely out of entitlement programs. And as a result of putting down about $250 billion in savings, the Republicans were willing to deal with tax increases and put those on the table. We passed that budget agreement. It was a tough budget agreement. President Clinton followed up in his budget with a budget that was very similar, $250 billion out of spending savings, $250 billion out of taxes. And as a consequence of those two agreements, plus the additional agreements that were made in the Congress to lock in some of the targets that were set by those agreements, we achieved a balanced budget. Not only did we achieve a balanced budget, but we achieved a surplus. And today, 28 years later, we are back in the deepest hole facing a president of the United States in our history. And this president is facing the largest debt burden in the history of this country, with the exception of maybe what Harry Truman had to face after World War II. In the instance of Harry Truman, it was pretty clear that once we got out of the war, that line was going to turn down. In this instance, there is no indication that the line is going to turn down. As a matter of fact, it's on an unsustainable path that will ultimately double the $20 trillion debt that we have and take us to $1 trillion deficits within the next few years, if not sooner, depending on what the President and Congress do. So, we are facing a situation with the new president coming in which he's got to face the same choice that President Bush faced, and that President Clinton faced, and that others have faced, which is, do you make the tough choices to fix this and be able to provide for a future for our children, for the country, or do you ignore the choices that have to be made and jeopardize our future? That is very simply the challenge that will face the new president. We lay out a number of recommendations. The first recommendation is that the president has to bring this issue to the American people. If we're going to get anything done, chances right now, let's not kid anybody, chances right now are very tough. From a political point of view on both sides, both Democrats and Republicans. But to make that change, we've got to convince the American people that this is an important issue that needs to be dealt with. Now, when George Bush was running, we had a guy named Ross Perot who came along and made this a big political issue. And there was a lot of political support and awareness for the need to do something. If we're going to do anything about this, the president's got to be willing to bring this issue to the American people, the issue of fiscal responsibility. So that's number one. Number two, the president has to, in what looks like almost two budgets that we'll be dealing with if they pass the CR, this president's going to have to deal with the 17 budget, and he's also going to have to then present his own budget for fiscal year 18. And he's going to have to identify goals. What does he want to achieve? Are we going to be on a path towards reducing the deficit? Are we going to be on a path that indicates fiscal responsibility? If we are, he's got to build those goals into his budget and establish that in the first budgets that are presented. And the third recommendation follows that if we really want to get this done, there is no other way to do it but to sit down in a room with the key players, put everything on the table, and develop a budget agreement that will provide a certain path for this country over the next 5 to 10 years as to what's to be achieved. As Secretary of Defense, I keep getting asked about the defense budget. You can't have a strong defense in this country if you don't have a certain budget that lays out certain numbers as to where we're going. It's impossible. So we need that. And very frankly, at a time in this country, we've been relying, because of nothing happening on the fiscal front, we've been relying on monetary policy. And you can't do that in our economy It takes both, obviously, monetary policy, but it takes fiscal policy as well. And when Bill Clinton did it, the combination of fiscal policy and monetary policy helped ultimately produce a strong economy. So, those are all the things that, that a new president needs to do. But most importantly, let's face it, this is a test of leadership. I often tell the students at our Panetti Institute, if you want to, in a democracy, we lead either by leadership or by crisis. If leadership is willing to take the risks associated with leadership, then we can control crisis and certainly try to eliminate crisis. But if leadership is not there, we will govern by crisis. And too often today in this area, we are governing by crisis. So that's the issue that the new president will have to confront.
Mitch and I are debating who goes second. I follow the memo, but we're giving him a break. And actually, Mitch has a little bit of a raspy throat, so we're going to give him time to drink his tea and get ready to queue up. I want to start by thanking the staff because this is being billed as a memo from the three co-chairs of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, but it's the great staff, Maya and her crew, that have done the bulk of the work here, and we're so appreciative of them helping us craft this message, and we think it's critical at this point, just as it is at any point between election and inauguration, to urge the incoming administration to take seriously the fiscal threat that the nation faces. So that's what the memo is all about, and I'm actually supposed to talk about items 8, 9, and 10 of this memo, which deal with healthcare costs, Social Security, and then picking an economic team. But let me start by just saying a couple things about my history on this issue, and I'm somewhat constrained because with Liam's introduction, I'm sort of reminded of the comment a politician made after 3 or 4 politicians had already spoken, and he said, well, everything has already been said, but it just hasn't been said by me. So I'm sort of in that role. But after leaving Congress, I was approached by Carol Cox Waite, who was then the president and founder of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, to join this austere, well, it is austere because this august organization. And I was baffled by that, because it was comprised of virtually everyone who had ever run the OMB, the GAO, the CBO, and then me. And several years later, Bill Frenzel, another Minnesota congressman who had been for many years on the Ways and Means Committee, was asked to chair the organization, and I was approached to co-chair with Bill Frenzel, and loved that role. I stepped away for a few years, but after Leon left the Clinton administration, he was asked to join Bill Frenzel as co-chair of the organization. And then when Leon was called back into service by the Obama administration, I resumed my role as co-chair, and now here we are again. So I always feel like I'm in high clover because I get to work with the likes of Mitch Daniels and Leon Mineta and the rest of the members of the board. Let me say this about the Andrews Air Force Base affair, because I think it's instructive about how we have to approach these issues. That was a White House, Senate, and House effort. So all of the major players in both political parties were engaged in that negotiation at Andrews Air Force Base. I remember Bill Frenzel telling me that the only problem with the negotiations, and one of the reasons it took so very long to come up with their package of recommendations, was that there was a dessert table sitting near the conference table, and people just spent more time at the dessert table than they did negotiating. But even though we had the Bush White House, Democrats and Republicans in both the House and the Senate leadership involved in that negotiation, it was still a hard slog. They came back with a recommendation, and it initially went down. One of the participants at that event, whose name shall go unmentioned, decided that he would lead the opposition to passage, and that led a majority of the Republican caucus to vote no. When we saw the votes going up in the board, what had been a majority of Democrats prepared to support the deal, then turned and voted no. So a majority of both caucuses voted down the first deal. The same group reassembled, came back with a second package, which then was approved. So even under those circumstances, with everybody around the table, everybody trying to move toward the same goal, it's not an easy thing to do. So it does take leadership, and I think that's the importance of Leon Panetta's remarks, is to remind us that leadership is the key element on this issue, and it really has to start at the White House, which is why this is a memo to the new president. 8, 9, and 10, healthcare. What did we hear on the campaign trail? We heard that the Affordable Care Act would be repealed and replaced. Okay. So what's the plan? We didn't hear. Almost as concerning, we didn't hear one word about Medicare reform. Not one. So these issues clearly have to be addressed. An opportunity will come with the passage of a 2017 budget resolution, which then could set in place an opportunity for reconciliation. And then subsequent to that, passage of a 2018 budget resolution, which then could set in place another opportunity for reconciliation. Something can happen on health care in one or both of those efforts. But what? What is the big question? I said at the time of the passage of the Affordable Care Act that it was all about access, and nothing there seriously addressed cost control. And I think as we've seen the implementation of the Affordable Care Act over the last several years, we're coming now to understand what a mistake it was not to link cost control to access, because these costs are going up and up every year. In Minnesota alone, 24% increase in premiums on the exchange. So that's the government subsidized program. But other aspects of the Affordable Care Act have led to 40, and 50, and 60% increases in the individual market in our state. You can say it only affects 5% of the people, but these are folks that have to buy in the individual market, and the implications of the law have led to huge increases for them. And I run a foundation with 18 employees. Third year in a row, we faced a 25% increase in our premium. Small employer plans have been affected by this. So whether it's the government programs, Medicaid, Medicare, the Affordable Care Act, or whether it's private sector, really cost control needs to be the big issue. So they should look at all these opportunities, repeal and replace, and revising our Medicaid plan. If you want to block grant to states, there are lots of options. What you need to think about, what are the policies that we can implement hand in glove with any of these reform efforts that deal with cost control in our healthcare system as it affects both public and private healthcare costs. So that's number one. Number two, Social Security. Payroll taxes no longer cover annual Social Security payments. So we're dipping into the trust fund. And I won't even get into the fiction of a trust fund that's been spent. But it does place the first priority on any tax dollars, because until we replenish the dollars we borrowed from the trust fund, it is an obligation that we're going to honor. But by 2030, we'll have only 2 workers for 1 retiree. And by 2034, when all of those trust fund dollars have been repaid and spent out, we'll only have enough annual tax revenue to support 79% of the promises that we've made to our retirees. It's often been said that demography is destiny, and that certainly applies to the Social Security program. It also applies to the Medicare program. Here again, our recommendation is what's been done in the past in this issue is probably a template for what can be done again. The Greenspan Commission back in 1982-83 took this off the radar screen. I ran for Congress that year, got elected in a Republican district that had only elected one other Democrat since statehood, and that Democrat served one term. But Social Security was not a big issue of debate in that campaign because the commission was working toward a solution, and all candidates had to say is, we're going to respect the recommendation of the commission. Bipartisan commission, buy-in from the administration, the House and the Senate, both political parties. Here again, even when those recommendations came forward, and these recommendations bought us all a pass during that election season, it was not an easy sell. We had to separate out raising the retirement age as a separate vote in order to get that package of recommendations forward. But much like the budget deal that Leon described a few moments ago, this asked a little sacrifice of everybody and a little sacrifice of both political parties, because in this deal, we did trim benefits by delaying cost of living increases. We did then delay retirement for the baby boom generation, and we implemented a series of payroll tax increases for the balance of the 1980s. But what did that plan do with those elements of cost control and revenue? It bought us 30 years of solvency in the Social Security system. And something like that can be done and needs to be done again. But it'll only be done with leadership from the White House, and that gets to the last point, number 10 on our list of recommendations, and that's a new president has to surround themselves with an economic team of talent. Listen to that team if you want to get things done. And it's not just the talent, it's a demonstrated capacity to negotiate and to work with all parties. So we don't know much so far. Mnuchin has been selected for Treasury, evidently has the talent. Does he know how to work with others to get things done? We don't know yet, we'll find out. Price has been nominated to head up Health and Human Services. He clearly has ideas about reforming our healthcare system, Medicaid, Medicare, the Affordable Care Act. He clearly has some ideas about cost control in the healthcare arena. So maybe that's a helpful thing. All of this will have to get some degree of support on Capitol Hill, and clearly as a member of Congress, he's got relationships there that may help. But we've got the Office of Management and Budget, the National Economic Council, the Chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. We've got other key positions, and we need to look not just for the skill to do the job, but the skill to negotiate with Capitol Hill. Clinton set an example, and I hesitate to offer that recommendation to this president, having just defeated President Clinton's spouse. But he reset the economic debate in the time frame between the election and the inauguration. First of all, he picked an outstanding economic team, Leon Panetta as director of the Office of Management and Budget, Alice Rivlin to be your hand-in-hand partner in that effort, Bob Rubin at Treasury, others that knew their stuff and knew how to work with Capitol Hill. And Clinton also went to Little Rock and had 2-3 days of economic conversation and actually backed away from some of the promises he made in the campaign because of the fiscal realities that he came to understand were more important than keeping some of those campaign promises. So a middle-class tax cut, which was central to his campaign theme, was no longer heard about. And instead of that, we did do something in the earned income tax credit for the lowest income folks. And Marty Russo was on the Basic Needs Committee at that time. So he reset the economic debate, put more focus on fiscal responsibility, and it can be done, and this is the time to do it. And a way to move in that direction is with the kind of team you surround yourself with. So if we want to be hopeful about the prospects for the new administration, it's that everything about Trump says he's a deal maker. And if he surrounds himself with good people and empowers them to make a deal, maybe fiscal responsibility is in the offing.
in fact, I can't talk. So let me be very, very brief and get on to the moderated part of the program. Obviously, I associate myself, as they say in this town, with the remarks of my distinguished colleagues. Just a couple other quick observations. One is that we're all finding out, this administration is still finding out about itself. That's only natural. All of them do. One of the few things we know at this point is that there's a strong appreciation that this country cannot succeed economically, socially, and certainly not fiscally. It's stagnated at 1 to 2% growth. And it's a sine qua non for progress in multiple areas. And they've placed apparently an immediate priority and premium on that, and that's great. Because everyone in this room knows that there is no path to a fiscally acceptable position, even over time, unless we see a reactivation of much stronger growth. And let's just hope that they find the combination of policies that will do that. I hope as they search for that, they will realize, if they haven't thought sufficiently about it now, that debt is itself is a huge brake on growth. It's not just the consequence of slow growth. It is an enormous impediment to long-term growth in this country, and it has to be in some sequence, in some significant fashion, a part of their, I hope, sustained 4-year effort to bring faster, more vitality and opportunity and faster growth in the American economy. Last thing I'll say is just that I've been waiting, I've said at least 2 elections, like presidential election cycles. This country cannot wait out another presidency without getting serious about this problem. And we're in round 3. I'm pretty sure I'm right this time. It's always been obvious to me that the not merely our material prosperity, which under the worst of circumstances, this is a wealthier, more blessed country than humanity's ever contemplated before. But the continued viability of our democratic institutions relies heavily on our economy continuing to deliver on the American promise. I'd love to believe that Americans support our institutions, consent to the governed, rule of law institutions, because they all read the Federalist Papers and absorbed this thrilling set of theories. But we all know that what has drawn Americans to these shores and what has maintained unity in this country, prevented class warfare, fostered enduring commitment to freedom and its institutions has been our consistent delivery, the system's consistent delivery on greater opportunity, one generation having a chance to do better than the last. And so, to me, there are even greater stakes now involved than maintaining ever better economic conditions for Americans. But more important even than honoring the basic, I think, stewardship responsibilities of government, not to exploit the president and leave greater problems to whoever succeeds you. But issues that can legitimately be framed as moral. And so on behalf of the 30,000 young people that I get to hang out with every day these days, and all their counterparts elsewhere, everyone here knows the disservice, the intergenerational injustice that we will do if we don't fix this, if we don't go to work on this problem soon. And it is worse than bad economics. It is worse than bad fiscal stewardship. It is immoral by any fair definition of that word to borrow money in gigantic quantities, spend it not on investment in the future, but on current consumption, to design systems, including our most recent healthcare system, which by their very essence demand that the young further subsidize their elders and then leave the mess that these innocent young people to clean up. Now, the president-elect didn't cause this problem, but I think he is that president for whom it will not wait another 4 years. And so I'm proud to be associated with this group. I think it's set of humble suggestions, modest suggestions that we've just made is one that can be accommodated to the program as it begins to take shape with this new administration. Everything does not have to be done in January and February and March of year one, but I hope everything needs to be done, to be fully contemplated and attempted in its proper time and sequence in a synergistic program that produces both growth and more moderate and sustainable debt levels over time. And I appreciate the chance to be here and to be associated with people who've been in that trench longer than I have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, thanks very much. Great introduction. Let's get started on trying to market thoughts to market, because it's obviously been a busy couple of weeks for the new administration. Number one in your list of priorities was for the president to use the bully pulpit of the position to emphasize the importance of fiscal consolidation and have a pathway there. And so I'd like to actually get the views of all of you, offer an interim report card of this administration on that front. Now, just to tilt the answer a little bit, I'll sort of bring up the interview that the first two members of the economic team gave yesterday, Steve Mnuchin and Wilbur Ross, Treasury and Commerce Secretary, nominees respectively on CNBC. And they talked about a lot of stuff in that interview. They talked about tax reform, they talked about Dodd-Frank, they talked about the mortgage market. Not once did they talk about the debt or the deficit. So not a lot of talk there. I don't recall seeing any of those things make it into the President-elect's Twitter feed recently. There was a homage to our first Treasury Secretary, of course, who was consolidated the national debt, but I don't think that had anything to do with the national debt. So I know it's early days, but could all three of you, starting with you, Secretary Panetta, give us an interim report card of how this administration is doing in terms of addressing the issues that you surface here?
Well, it's incomplete, to say the least, if not D minus. Nobody's paying attention to the debt issue. And the fact is, for most of this campaign, the reality is that while it was mentioned a few times, mentioned by the President-elect, mentioned by Secretary Clinton, the reality is that it was not one of those driving issues that was constantly raised with the American people in terms of the problems and the threats that were involved. So we're at a time when, frankly, neither party, my own party, the Democratic Party, or the Republican Party, seems very enthused about having to take on the issues that you've got to take on if you're going to deal with the debt. So as a result of that, you don't hear a hell of a lot about the debt and the dangers involved with the debt. So that remains a very fundamental issue. Look, if the politics aren't with you on this issue, and this is tough enough, I mean, to try to get members, let's face it, try to get members to either raise taxes, even in the context of tax reform, or even touch entitlement programs in order to get savings there. I mean, these members will run for the doors. And, to a large extent, the President-elect has kind of, emphasized both areas, that he's not going to, he's certainly not talking about raising taxes, and he's not even talking about touching Social Security or Medicare. So you've got a problem on both parties with regards to the will to deal with this issue. So the question then becomes, can the President of the United States, recognizing the responsibility of the President, go to the American people and say, we cannot allow this issue not dealt with because of what it'll do to our economy, because of what it'll do to my ability to do the things that I promised I would do for the American people. He's got to be able to do that. Now, will he? That's going to be the fundamental question. I mean, right now, I don't see that as a high priority, if you want to know the truth. I mean, we'll beat them up, we'll try to, do what we can here. But until the American people recognize that this better be dealt with or their future of their children is going to be in jeopardy. Until that connection is made, we're not going to be able to get much done.
Councilman Petty, what's your assessment?
I think it's tragic that the first time since 1980 we had a presidential campaign in which deficit and debt wasn't one of the major debate items, in which both candidates competed to present credible plans toward approaching the issue. So that's disheartening. I'll give credit to Maya and her team that to the degree the deficit and debt came up during this campaign, it came up because of the material they were developing and feeding to the news media. It ended up in several of the debates because the moderators used Committee for Responsible Federal Budget material to pose questions in those debates. And I think it had an influence on the economic plans of both candidates. Trump's tax cuts were like a $12 trillion deal to begin with, and he cut that in half by the end of the campaign. I'd like to think that the committee's influence on that was felt, and Clinton didn't jack up the deficit all that much, didn't reduce it by a dime, but at least all of her new stuff was offset on a pay-as-you-go basis. So there again, I think the committee had an influence on that. But to Leon's point, if we're going to get anything done, it essentially starts and stops with the president.
Governor Daniels?
Because if the president doesn't take the lead on this issue, don't expect Congress to jump out in front and take the lead. So that's why the memo, that's why this amendment.
So, Governor Daniels, you've been through this process before of creating a new administration in the interim period. How disappointed should we be that we haven't heard more from the president-elect and his folks on these issues?
Well, I'm not incrementally disappointed because we haven't did anything for the last 23 days, but we didn't hear anything for the previous 500 from anybody. And then there were debates, as I recall, with somewhere between 17 and 150 people, candidates on the stage. None of them talked about it either, I mean, either side. Now, I'll offer a slightly different expression of hope. There are certainly people in the Congress, and Paul Ryan is the best example I can think of, but he's not alone, who understand exactly what we're looking at here, and have been thinking about it a long time, and who I believe think, as I think, that there's a vocabulary for talking to American people about this. They'll give you one clue. Most people would never intentionally plunder their young. It's not. In fact, that's what's bothering most Americans. My kids won't live better than I do. Well, if there's a chance of that. If there is, the biggest risk of that happening is the issue, the intention of the issue that we're dealing with here. So I actually think, yes, it would be good if the new administration and the president-elect decided, we need to elevate this in our agenda and in our list of problems we've got to tackle. Because it is all tangled up with growth and things that we know we would do better at. But I would wait on that. I do think there's some hope, I think, that in the interaction with majorities of both houses, they're very happy, sure to have that there may be some agreement, some meeting of the minds, which does elevate this issue. Let's hope that happens.
If I could just, I'm not sure, I think we all understand the possibilities of, both parties sitting in a room and doing what was done in the past in terms of an agreement probably washed out. I would think the real test of whether or not this is going to be an issue or not is going to come up very early with regards to infrastructure and whether or not you're going to pay for the infrastructure bill that's done. I mean, if both parties decide just to borrow $1 trillion in order to put into infrastructure, that'll send a hell of a signal as to where they're headed. If, on the other hand, they struggle with trying to come up with some way to pay for infrastructure, I think that'll be an important signal. I think if you do a large tax cut here, then it all goes directly to the deficit or to the debt. that's another idea. So there'll be some early tests as to whether or not the Congress is serious about beginning to take this issue.
But if I could, Governor Daniels, if I could come back to you for a moment, because I think one of the reasons the markets have been so euphoric by the possibility of fiscal stimulus coming is because it's going to be one-party government. The Republican Party controls the White House and both chambers of Congress. And I think one of the interesting questions we're going to have is that, like, the Republican House certainly has been very, very hard on the Obama administration about the deficits and debt that have accumulated, right? But one suspects or one wonders whether their hawkishness on the deficit will disappear once one of their own is in the White House. In particular, where they'll have quite a bit more accommodating view about deficits that are caused by steep tax cuts as opposed to deficits that are caused by spending increases. What do you predict, and would you advise your former colleagues on the co-partists on the Hill to not change their view on those things?
I don't know what to predict. I think it's not unnatural that they be deferential 23 days after a surprise outcome like this. And while people are being identified, policies are just beginning to take shape. I don't know too many of these folks. Been lots of turnover in the many years since I served my second sentence in the federal government. But the ones I do know or have observed are, you can disagree with their principles, but these are very firm, people with very firm principles, sometimes being too much so. So I wouldn't be too quick to assume that they'll suddenly change their spots. I would expect that at least a lot of them, people to whom I'll run in, for instance, would I don't have to be somewhat responsive, but maybe will want to be responsive, innovating will raise these very same issues that we've talked about.
And Congressman, what do you think? I mean, the Democratic Party obviously has limited leverage as a minority party, but do they have some leverage, and how do you recommend they use it in the upcoming budget process?
Well, I think we can count on them to put the brakes on tax cut to the extent that they have power to do so. Especially in the Senate, if this is not handled through reconciliation, and it's very hard to move the tax legislation forward. So that's one. But I think on other issues like cost containment, they may have some leverage on that issue in terms of working with Republicans on cost containment, so long as some structure of the exchanges for low-income folks to access health care are maintained. There may be some leverage that they can apply there to keep some of the Affordable Care Act structure in exchange for agreeing with Republicans on cost control. So I do worry about infrastructure because I have a sense that the administration feels that we've got low interest rates, now's the time to borrow. And I fear that Democrats, because this is all about public works, may not mind borrowing the money for that purpose as well. So that might be the real challenge. And I agree with Leon, that could be an indication. I've often joked that very often when there's a budget deal that's worked out, as there have been extra sessions in years past, it's often the worst kind of deal, where both sides get more spending and the deficit gets set aside. And I fear that could happen on infrastructure. But on the other two issues, I think if they want to apply some fiscal pressure, they certainly could and should.
Okay. I just make a comment about what really concerns me. Most of the people, there are a lot of familiar faces here who have seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. And the reality is, I had the honor of seeing Washington when it worked. And when Republicans and Democrats are willing to sit in a room and be able to negotiate, be able to agree on issues, and then try to decide what to do about it. My great fear right now is that because truth is a victim. And during the course of this campaign, and it continues to be a victim, not only in this country, but around the world, that there is an inability to agree on the facts as to how much of a danger this is. And if everybody is clouding their minds and not even agreeing to the basic facts, how can you then expect people to really then sit in a room and do something about something they can't even agree on the truth of? And that's a real problem. And it's part of the atmosphere we're in, where if people can't even agree on the fundamental facts, how the hell do we expect to get anything done on an issue of this, of this enormity?
Congressman Penny, I want to come back to you for a second on the specifics about what you want the administration and Congress to do. And the question of entitlements, you talked about this in your opening remarks about needing to deal with Social Security and health care. So I'm going to sort of like contribute a hypothetical meeting that you have with President-elect Mr. Trump. Everybody knows on both sides of the aisle that Social Security and Medicare are on an unsustainable path. You didn't talk about it much on the campaign trail, but now's the time to talk about how you're going to bring those costs under control. And the president will respond to you, says, Mr. Penny, thank you very much, but I carried your district by X percentage points. And I did that in part by telling those people who voted for me that I wasn't going to cut their Social Security and their Medicare like everybody other guy, including Paul Ryan, who lost 4 years ago, did. So explain to me why I should do that. And I think that that's a reasonable point, because there are people hurt back there. These are people who relied on these programs. And one of the messages that you read from the election is that these are people who wanted folks in Washington to pay attention to them and worry about their priorities. You get the sense that those people, that the priority for those people, and therefore Mr. Trump is not entitlements. So what's the next part of that conversation?
Well, that's why I said in my remarks and in my response to your first question is to really start the president, because it does make it far more difficult if the president doesn't take this issue seriously. And between now and inauguration is the opportunity to kind of reset the debate, retest the debate. So it depends on who he gathers around him and who he listens to, and we ought to be watching and reading those tea leaves very carefully. It is a tough sell because in southern Minnesota, which I had the honor to serve for 6 terms, every county in my district, save one, went for Trump between 60 and 65%. There's a paradox, because the same voters in my district who say that they care deeply about deficit reduction haven't made the connection that Social Security and Medicare have anything to do with the deficits. And so I think it is a hard sell. And I don't think that Trump is so much a factor, except that if he's not taking the lead on this issue, then members of Congress not only have to advance this issue out here, they have to educate back home. I don't think he's going to come into their districts and cause them harm, but he has made the challenge of persuading folks and convincing folks of the need to take these actions much more difficult. And that's why I'm less optimistic than you are about the ability of members of Congress to kind of force this issue without presidential leadership.
Governor Daniels, there's a lot of Trump voters in Indiana. How would you go to those voters and say, dealing with entitlements is in your best interest in a way that's politically sellable?
Yeah, well, I said when I said that I thought there's a vocabulary for this, I really do. And every demagogue, of course, either party starts out with whether they want to wreck Social Security or take away your Social Security. So I think the first thing you have to point out to people is that no, those people are the threats. We're here to save the safety net, which otherwise we're going to lose. And then you have to start, I would start, and I've done this in audiences, even though I didn't never run for a federal office, but people were curious. And I think you start by saying, now, everyone listen, nothing will change for you. If you're over, pick your number, 50 or 55, nothing will change for you. You get that? Nothing will change for you. Did I mention nothing will change for you? Now, we would like there to be something there for your kids. I mean, so you're good to go. Deal's a deal. We agree with you. Now, there's a mortal danger your kids won't have the same safety net. And we need to start some things now that take effect very gradually and in the future. So that's what we're here to work on. But nothing will change for you. And I just cling to the notion that American people can be spoken to that way. I understand the temptations not to, and I've heard the constant, the God be around this thing. Somebody's got to try. And I just say, the case is a strong one, as we know. It's my own view, but everybody in this room knows we cannot solve the debt problem. It's already too bad. Does anybody disagree with that? We're going to default on the debt by one definition or another. We're going to inflate our way. We're going to repress our way as the bankers. So we've just been doing that, right? Remember, the negative interest rates or artificially low interest rates. One reason that the recent deficits have been only awful instead of unthinkable. So we are that lucky country who prints the world's reserve currency. We're that lucky country that is still the best place with all our self-inflicted economic obstacles to invest and so forth. And so I believe all the new administration has to do, is get started, show the world that we're on a long way path not to have a cataclysm, and the world will bridge finance this country, even though we can't really bring it down and pay it off.
The problem is, none of this is easy. None of this is easy. I mean, we would have solved this problem a long time ago if it was easy. I mean, the problem is Republicans, don't want to raise taxes. I mean, this goes back to the 80s. Republicans don't want to raise taxes, cut defense. Democrats don't want to touch Social Security, Medicare, the entitlements, or domestic discretionary spending. That's the politics. Neither of them, want to touch programs that are important to their constituencies. So the only way you're ever going to get a deal is if both are willing to put both issues on the table. And that's the only way we're going to get a budget deal. I mean, the problem is right now the Congress has been futzing around with discretionary spending and cutting the hell out of discretionary spending. The sequester has damaged defense, it's damaged other programs. You're not going to balance the budget on discretionary programs. Come on. So if you want to deal with it, then you've got to agree on the facts, which are that if we don't deal with it, Medicare is going to go broke, Social Security is going to go broke, these benefits are going to be hurt, and by the way, the economy is going to be seriously impacted, and we will have no growth. This is a real problem. If you agree on that, then the next step is to say, you do entitlement savings, entitlement reform, the Republicans do tax reform, that raises some taxes, and that's the deal. And they both have to walk the plank. And if they walk the plank, we get the deal done. This isn't going to be pleasant. And the fact is, there'll probably be some members who lose their seats because of that decision. Members lost their seat voting for the Clinton budget. That's a tough vote. And that's why people stay away from this stuff. That's why the leadership doesn't lead on this stuff. That's why presidents don't stay away from this stuff. Because it's tough. But the only way we're going to deal with this is when everybody is prepared to say, we're willing to sacrifice and to do the right things for our programs. You have to be willing to do the right thing for your program. And then you both sides have to walk that plank together.
We have just 1 minute left. I want to ask one quick question. There's a saying in this town nowadays, personnel is policy. The president still has to appoint a budget director. Secretary Panetta, Governor Youngkin both had that job before. What is the one piece of advice you would give to that person that could really make a difference besides having room to his main client, which is the president?
Well, it helps if he's one tough son of a bitch. The most important thing is, A, that that person knows numbers and knows the budget and understands what the hell the implications are, because most presidents don't know all the pieces that make up the federal budget. So you need somebody that knows the budget. And number two, has a good relationship with the president, so that the president trusts that individual. And if you have those two qualities, that's pretty important.
As in other jobs, I think the one question is, what are the limits of my authority? How much, Mr. President, will you let me do for you? Budget directors can either be the hammer or the administration. I used to tell our people, we're here to solve 10 problems a day, so the president never has to do it unless they spend his own time on it. Others are, frankly, are just mechanics and kind of ciphers, and it all has to do with if the president sees what that job can do for him. And people know, cabinet members and others know, there's no sense of messing, with that, because when he speaks, the president's going to be behind him in 99% of the cases. I think it's in the president's interest, frankly, to set it up that way, but some don't want it that way or don't see that.
If he's smart, he will appoint someone like Mitch or Leon.
Trump, if you're listening, thanks very much.
Close on time and before Governor Daniels, President Daniels loses his entire voice. So that's. I'm going to take 1 second because I thought your question about entitlements was so important. And there's another piece of it, which is entitlements weren't discussed during this election. We had people either talking about walking away from the issue or, in fact, expanding entitlements. When our biggest programs are 50% of the budget, and if you look going forward, they're 75% of the overall growth in the budget. And so the fact that this was a missing issue is huge. And I think part of the answer to your question is just tell the truth. Nobody gets into this issue of fiscal responsibility because it's fun. It's not like, hey, let's talk about more revenues and cutting spending and reforming entitlements because it's such a good time. It's hard work. And the reason people are committed to it, because if you look at the numbers, you realize just how real it is. And for Social Security, Donald Trump said he was going to fix the program from waste, fraud, and abuse. Okay, that's not going to fix the program. Even if you got rid of every bit of it, that would extend the trust fund for just a few months. But what is true is that when today's 49-year-old retires, there are going to be across-the-board benefit cuts of more than 20%. Not of people who can afford them, but of everybody. And that can't be the solution. So I think it comes back to budgetary trade-offs and making hard choices and thoughtful and exhibits leadership. I will say, when I first took over this organization as president, Leon gave that same talk about it's going to take leadership or it's going to take crisis. And then I think under his breath he kind of muttered, at a big board meeting, it's probably going to be a crisis. That is not an inspiring first day of work. But it's not going to be a crisis. There's going to be able to be leadership that comes from the top and from the Congress and from outsiders who can help push it. So that's why we keep working on it. Thank you so much to our panel for joining us, and thank you all.